Hey everybody, Ian Bremmer here, and it is top risks time, not yet for 2026, but to look back on the last year, on how we did. I think it's incredibly important. It's a very useful exercise, I know, for me and all of our colleagues at Eurasia Group, but I think it's useful to do publicly too. You look back closely at what you actually wrote and what you were really thinking, not a charitable reinterpretation from your memory months later, because we all know when we don't look at the real facts, we don't look at what we actually said, what we actually wrote, what we actually did, we know how handsome and smart and charismatic we all are in our memories. And when we look back on 2025 and remind you these top risk pieces, which we've been doing for 20 years now, are where we think the biggest geopolitical risks in the world are going to be for the coming 12 months, not 5, not 10 years, so short term, are going to be in terms of impact, likelihood, and imminence. Those are the three things that we rate, in a sense, that we weight, and that's what gets you 1 to 10. And then we have some red herrings at the end of things that people think are risks that we really don't think so. Now, top line, if you go back, and I'll put a link in here so everyone can go and read along for themselves. And I think, if you have time, I think it's really worth doing. Top line, it looks really good. And I'll say, first of all, the number one risk was kind of a layup. I mean, to say GZERO wins, and we've been writing about a GZERO world for some 15 years now, a lack of global order, a geopolitical recession or bust cycle, where the United States isn't providing global leadership for better and for worse. And nobody else is willing and capable of taking America's place. Now, over the past 15 years, that has initially been driven by a number of factors, like Russia not being integrated after Soviet collapse into the West, the NATO-Russia Council, the G7+1, all of that being fake symbolism, and Russia being really angry about it and acting as a revisionist country. China being integrated through the WTO and through global market investment and expansion and capital flows, but not aligning with the West in its political or economic system, priorities, ambitions, and therefore not being accepted by the West as a leader, and that causing increasing conflict. And then the fact that the United States itself was less interested in a lot of the things that had promoted that order, like collective security and free trade. But if you look at 2025, you're really talking principally about the United States doing the driving, that the second Trump administration, with America first, really driving its policies and ideas of sovereignty, control of border, control of identity politics inside the border, control of investments and more onshoring and reshoring and more state investments into firms, and the government putting its finger in terms of who should the winners and losers be, and using tariffs as a principal instrument of U.S. policy. All of those things really drove a much greater GZERO environment. And if we look at the leaders around the world talking about the end of Pax Americana, even German Chancellor Friedrich Merz just in the last week, they're all focusing on the United States as the principal driver. And I would say that's a strong validation of GZERO winning, being the top risk for 2025. The second risk, also all about the United States. And again, why is the U.S. so highly rated in this report? Well, one, it's by far the most powerful country, but two, it also is led by a leadership that is trying to drive a very different orientation towards policy. And number two risk was rule of dawn. And that the second administration would be wildly different from the first, not just in terms of its ability to execute on a sovereignty focus, but also in its efforts to weaponize the administrative state and make it loyal to the Trump administration, the power ministries, the IRS, the FBI, the Department of Justice, much more directly loyal, even some more technocratic administration pieces, components like the FCC. And taking that fight against political enemies seen to be the principal adversary to Trump and therefore the United States, as opposed to external adversaries like the Russians and the Chinese. And doing this in large part because President Trump and his supporters believe that they have had the same done against them in terms of his two impeachments, in terms of the all of the convictions and the investigations and even the assassination attempts, one of which almost came very close to killing him. And whether or not you agree with that, the fact that that is what is motivating and driving the Trump administration with a level of urgency, with very strong loyalty, and with much more execution capacity and experience than he had in the first term, was really driving that risk. So the risks 1 and 2, I think, came out quite well and really very aligned with everything we wrote back in January. And it was fun to reread as a consequence. Now, the places in the report where we got it wrong, I would say, and were fairly consistently secondary effects of the risks where the headline was correct, but there were big components of those risks that didn't play out the way we expected. 3 in particular: Russia, Iran, the Middle East, and U.S.-China. Russia, still rogue. The idea that at the end of 2025, Russia would still be the principal rogue state and treated and oriented as such that sanctions wouldn't be over, they'd actually be expanded. There'd be more asymmetric fighting between NATO, especially frontline states, and Russia. It would be more of a global risk. But we did think that there would be at least a temporary ceasefire that would prove successful, that Trump's efforts to get the war concluded and his willingness to put a lot on the table to Putin in terms of showing him respect, making phone calls, engaging in personal summitry. We saw in Anchorage willingness to roll back American sanctions and the freezing of the small American assets they had, and weakening Europe as a consequence, that would be something that Putin would jump at least for a short period of time to give Trump the win. Didn't happen. That piece surprising to Trump, surprising to me as well. But in terms of the general trajectory of the conflict in Russia, ended up where we expected. Iran, entering the year in 2025 in big trouble, weaker than they'd been at almost any point really since the revolution started in 1979. And thought that they would collapse even more geopolitically, and that is certainly true. The axis of resistance, so-called, is basically no more, at best a shadow of what it was a year, 2-3 years ago. The Israelis able to engage in strikes that meaningfully set back their missile program and their nuclear capabilities. The Americans jumping in. Iran hitting Israel back, and there were indeed 28 civilians killed in Israel, despite very effective civil defense and military defense capabilities, but no strikes against the U.S. In the region, basically crying uncle after that. What we didn't see was Iran having a 1989 moment, that despite the geopolitics playing out the way we expected, there wasn't any political instability that was meaningful inside Iran itself. 86-year-old supreme leader ailing, failing geopolitically, failing economically, much of their military leadership assassinated directly by Israel, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and yet so much capability still to repress brutally their own population, that we didn't see even the beginnings of that social instability. Didn't expect a 1991 moment where Iran would collapse, but did think there'd be more meaningful instability. That hasn't played out yet. And then finally, U.S.-China. where we said that there was going to be a breakdown in U.S.-China relations, and indeed there has been a breakdown. That breakdown was really significant. We saw it on Liberation Day, where the United States functionally put a trade boycott on China, as well as expanding a lot of the restrictions in technology that was being exported by the United States to China. China responded in kind, which was expected, hit back, and then on the back of that, Trump basically backed down. That's where we got the taco trade. Trump always chickens out, which plays out in some other places like Brazil, doesn't play out with the Mexicans or Canadians or the Europeans or the Brits or the Japanese or the South Koreans. But with China, which had the ability and the willingness to hit the United States back hard, that led to a much briefer, albeit very sharp, breakdown in U.S.-China relations than we expected in the risk. Now, the relationship is still problematic. Overall trade levels are reduced. There is still very much an orientation towards decoupling between U.S. and China in any place where there's strategic vulnerabilities. The U.S. is urgently working to build alternative supply chain on critical minerals and semiconductor capabilities outside of TSMC. That's all very, very much in train. But Trump's desire to have summit meetings with Xi Jinping that go well was not something we expected in the top risk report back in January. Lots of other areas to look at: AI unbound, implications for Trumponomics, and much, much more. You can go back and have an unvarnished read. I think you'll find it constructive. Before we come back with the top risks for 2026 on Monday, January 5th, that is one that you won't want to miss. Really looking forward to it. I'll talk to you all real soon.